regions or 16 including the autonomous region. Actually, based on our experience encountered from the autonomous area in the community level, it doesn't know what is federalism, what is autonomy. So, meaning, this is only my point of opinion na maybe, hopefully, within the curriculum of the school, we practices this. Hopefully, we will practice. Before we implement, we need to encourage the orientation from the elite level, of course, going down to the ordinary community. Hopefully, kasi if we study on last experience ni Undoy, nakita ko yung parang nagkaroon ng level of yung pagkakaisa dahil sa crisis na yan. So, baka hopefully ito i-struggle din na encourage. Kasi to encourage in development, may yung unity not only by the during crisis, no, hopefully yung idea na equitable, equal distributions of wealth. Hopefully, not only the power, wealth including the power, hopefully yung treatment as a humanitarian we did. Thank you.
Thank you, Herman. Good morning. My name is Ruth Lucero Rico. I'm with the Department of Political Science. My interest is in the politics of access and use of natural resources. I think three questions can be considered as basic questions in terms of relating this to the whole issue of federalism. Mr. Anderson mentioned earlier that it's important also to talk about funding, natural resource use, or the whole issue of how this is managed at the local level. And of course, another concern is protection of the environment. So in the Philippines, I'll try to make this as brief as possible without giving a lecture. In the Philippines, let me just summarize it, the situation as it's very complicated. There is a law called the 1995 Mining Act, which allowed foreign companies to explore and extract natural resources, minerals from in territories here in the Philippines, and well, the implementation of this law has become very contentious. It was challenged in the Supreme Court, and it's a long story. But now it is currently being implemented. The basic issue here is, again, I will go back to the questions. Who owns? It's the state. Okay? But there are laws, aside from the 1995 Mining Act, there's also the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, and the Local Government Code, which have provisions that sort of, well, some people say they have to be harmonized, to make the long story short. Okay, so people keep talking about the role of the local communities in all this, and the situation is like this. There are many rich areas in the Philippines, but the people are very poor. So it's also a question that is anchored on the type of politics that is dominating the whole country. But okay, here's my question, because Mr. Anderson has a long experience and also has gone to different countries. Is there any model that we can probably learn from to draw lessons on how to go about this? As I said, I don't have all the time to explain the situation in the Philippines, but I have studied a few cases in Brooks Point in Palawan, in Victoria Oriental, Mindoro, and the last one is a very popular case, Rapu-Rapu in the province of Albay. So all these cases point to the problem of, again, being very resource rich, but the people do not benefit from the resources that are extracted. Thank you.
Good morning. I am Nonoy Oflan from Minimal Government Thinkers. market is. I came late. I was able to catch the reaction by Dr. Brillantes. So I would like to comment. This proposal is that the distribution of ERA one consideration to about the poverty. So I think that he suggested that the higher the poverty rate in a province, the more ERA you should give. And that will create moral hazard because I'm a politician. I want to do is to steal money and to make my people poorer. And next year we will get more ERA, and then pass on to my brother to put in the poverty. So whatever tinkering in the distribution, it will only create some moral hazard or whatever manipulation, because that's really good politicians doing, very good doing that. I mean, to extract more money from taxpayers. And that would lead me to my point. I noticed that government in general just specializes on waste, no? I think the high public debt all over in many countries around the world is just an indicator. Because waste, public debt is an accumulation of waste in the past, no? There, governments living beyond their means, you know, they spend much larger than the revenues, and that's why they accumulated. And if you notice that almost, except America, almost all of these governments which have very high public debt, in fact, are all parliamentary governments. Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, Spain, Germany, France, UK, Canada, etc. Almost all of them. I counted something like about 30, only about 7 are presidential, and the rest are mainly parliamentary. Not only parliamentary, also federal. So, it doesn't, my point is that it doesn't matter whether it's presidential, parliamentary, or federal, or centralized. I think that the point is that too much government, too much waste, the specialization of government. And I think that many people, what they really want is not so much the transfer of power from central government to the local government. That's why we have decentralization, devolution, and federalism. I think that you will notice here a lot of the functions used to be done by the government, done by the private sector, like peace and order. The ones who maintain peace and order in the malls, in the universities, in movies house, are not the government's forces, and not even their government budgets. Barangay there, these are private security guards. The ones who create good housing is not even the national government. It's the Gawad, Kalinga, things like that. They're all private sector initiative. So I think that if the desire of people is to have more efficient government, more efficient society, or more equitable society, the solution may not even be in government, with the national or central or local. It's with the private sector and the civil society. So I think that's one point that many discuss about parliamentarism and federalism tend to gloss over, no? Because they tend to focus the mentality of the people just set with the what from government. When we talk about you should tell government, people like that, government step out and let the power of civil society and NGO and voluntary organizations to take over. And thank you.
One last question for this round, Chal. Then we'll have another round later on.
Good morning. I am Jaldo Tagibo from the Department of Political Science. My question is just short and clarificatory. Earlier in this occasion, Mr. Anderson mentioned about his impressions and the complexities that we have insofar as the institutional arrangements are concerned, particularly between the national and the local units. And you mentioned the words strong government, and you found it unusual, which gave me the impression that there were some parts of it in its practice or in its setup that you were a bit critical or you were disagreeing with. And then towards the end, Dr. Brillantes was pushing for strong government also by means of devolution. So maybe I just would like that clarified so far as the two speakers are concerned. Thank you.
Alex, would you like to start things off? Or?
maybe I'll start with the last two speakers, just because I can speak very quickly to those items. In terms of the role of government here versus civil society, one of the things that is striking, actually, I mean, you can talk about the quality of government, but the size of government here is not that big. Tax revenues or government revenues in the Philippines are about 14% of GDP at the moment, which puts you at the low end of middle-income countries in terms of the size of government. A country like Brazil is more like, I think they're around 40%. And so, one of the features of this country is that a lot of the enriched programs that you find in many countries, the government doesn't have the revenues for. It's not as though you have over big government at the moment. Arguably, your government is too small. It has other weaknesses, but anyway, that's just a kind of contextual comment. In terms of the path to devolution and strong versus weak governments and so on, the first comment I'd make is that you have this structure at the moment of central government, provinces, and local governments. And now one's creating in Mindanao a regional government, and you have these regions that are there on the map that don't actually have any functions. One of the things that we've seen in some countries, and Italy is a good example, is that as Italy has been federalizing in a kind of backward way, sort of backing into it, if I could put it that way. And what they did is they had the central government, provinces and municipalities, and then they created regions, but they didn't eliminate the provinces. And they also have, of course, the European Union. So they've now got 5 tiers of government, and this gets very complicated for people. And so you get into this question of path dependency, and when you do devolve, can you be, where do you want to devolve to? If you chose as your federal model to go to basically make the provinces the key unit. How many provinces do you have? It's 80. 80. So around 80 provinces.
As of yesterday.
But that would make that's a very large number of units to have for a federation. Russia has 88, but the United States has 50, but those are the high end. I mean, a more manageable number in a federal structure is usually in the 8 to 25 range, which is the number, your regions fall into that range. So, but if you want to move towards a regional structure, a devolution by stealth could prove difficult, because you could find that devolution, you can't devolve to the regions at the moment because they don't exist. And you could find that what you're doing is building up the provinces, and then at one stage having to address the fact that the provinces are not the units you want to devolve to. Now maybe they are, but that's a question you need to think through, it seems to me, because it could affect sort of the strategic or tactical approach you take. In terms of the local government versus the provinces, I can't really pretend to have a considered view on that, because I've only been here 12 hours. But what does strike me as odd is the emphasis on resource sharing at the local government level. And I can just give you the example of Brazil, which is the only other country I know which has local government as opposed to provincial or state or regional government getting a share of resource revenues. I mean, and in Brazil, quite a large percentage of the resource revenues goes to the municipal level. And you've got some cities which are awash in money. In one case, and it can be as arbitrary for the offshore as what is the shape of your shoreline. If the city sits on a peninsula, it has a big offshore area, because it's the lines get drawn out and it's a great big triangle. Whereas if your city is on the inside of a bay, you have a very narrow. So this is what's called orthogonal lines. It's totally arbitrary, but it means that cities in the same state, 10 miles from one another, can have hugely different amounts of money, and the ones that are awash in money are not managing it very well. And so it seems to be that a fundamental question to think about with the resource sector, particularly given that you have the advantage at this juncture of not having big resource revenues, is thinking through, before you get into the reality, thinking through, well, what would be the principles of an equitable distribution? And I'm not saying you shouldn't have anything for the local governments, but what would be a reasonable amount? And how would versus provinces or regions versus the federal government? On the issue of devolution and just sort of passing it down to local oligarchs, this is absolutely a phenomenon you see in many federal countries. The provinces or states are run by big families, or in the worst cases gangs and so on. So maybe it's different oligarchs. The national oligarchs would be less powerful, and you'd be creating stronger people at the regional level. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's also the case that at the regional levels, in many cases, the checks and balances are weaker because the big families control a few things, the press is quite weak, etc. And this has led in a number of federal countries to a lot more emphasis on the central government having some degree of oversight of what's going on in the provinces or the states. And so you're getting what are called fiscal accountability acts of different kinds, or transparency provisions. They can include things like what the audit provisions are, so that in India, for example, this goes right back to the foundation of the Indian Union, there's one Auditor General for the whole country. Whereas in Nigeria, every state has its Auditor General. There are 36 states, and many of them are totally ineffective. So, how are audits done? There also can be issues around macroeconomic management and access to debt. But Brazil, they had a period where all of their state banks were operating off budget. They ran up huge debts, they got into deep trouble, the federal government had to bail them out. And following all of that, they did a major Fiscal Responsibility Act, where they now have detailed requirements for the states to publish their accounts on a monthly basis. Money won't be transferred to them if they're in violation of certain reporting requirements. Governors can be charged criminally if they don't operate in certain ways. Certain kinds of expenditures can't be done in the year before an election because they're bribing voters, etc. It's generally been viewed to be a successful piece of legislation, although parts of it are controversial. But there are, I think, if you think about it, devolution, you have to think through these issues. Let's not be naive that democracy is going to flourish everywhere and all the gardens are going to be green. There will be problems, and you need to be fairly clear-minded about the structures you have in place to deal with those. Last comment, well, I'm afraid to make two comments, just given the questions, is on the ordinary communities. We've seen evolution in a lot of countries where these same issues arise in terms of the quality of the population. People are illiterate, or they don't understand. Your average, if you went to the regional level for devolution, the regions would be quite big. It'd be about average population 7 million. I don't know what the smallest would be, but these are not village leaders that people have access to. And this is always a problem, but you're always trying to balance getting a structure that permits a coherent level of larger planning, infrastructure, a quality of the public service, etc., with being closer to the people. And getting closer to the people, particularly in terms of having the local language used as the language of government, very important in a number of countries which have evolved. But you clearly need to have still vibrant local government, etc. The indigenous people and mining, there are provisions for how, for giving special rights to indigenous people. It's a big issue now in South America. It's certainly been a big issue in Canada and the United States. The provisions vary. One way to come at it is to actually have agreements with them, which in Northern Canada we call treaties, which set out their rights in a very explicit way. But we also have parts of the country which are still not under treaty, where the courts have developed a doctrine called the right to consultation, and it's quite aggressive in terms of if there is oil and gas development or other kinds of which affects their traditional way of life, the courts are quite demanding that there be not just pro forma consultations, but it's evidence of serious discussions and a serious effort to accommodate the concerns of the local people, falling short of giving an absolute veto, but there could be a veto if there was a feeling that it was being abused. But this is a whole other area of dealing with Indigenous people, and I think I've spoken enough.
Despite the slow progress that I mentioned, or the lack of enough progress in bringing about institutional changes through legislation like the local government code, local autonomy code, and in fact, progress is happening with our local governments. I think Professor Brillantes mentioned the Galimpo awards, and there are all kinds of awards. I happen to know best my home province of Bohol, and our governor has been getting awards, national awards, for being such a good provincial government executive. And the awards also recognition come from the grassroots. So I'm not at all. I am aware of this, and I'd like to encourage you by recognizing that, in fact, some good things are happening, in spite of the structures, limitations of the structure. And I should also say that, despite our inability to bring about big changes, shift from presidential to parliamentary, from a highly centralized unitary system to more devolution. The ideas of the reform ideas are gaining currency. More and more people are aware of this. And somebody mentioned here that ordinary citizens do not understand. That's not true. In the dialogues that we have held in the provinces, they understand these things. You have to explain clearly your ideas and so on. And they are basically intelligent people, you know? And they are so concerned about improving things in the localities. And so, Dr. Brillantes and I don't have much to show in terms of the big change. But I think we have been mainstreaming these ideas. The idea is to mainstream the ideas to people who, you start with those who have the advantage of education and possession in local governments or in business or in civil society. And so these ideas are percolating, and they're thinking about it and so on. So there is the progress that's going on. Without the Big Bang yet happening. Now, somebody has said that government should just step out, leave the affairs of governance and development to business and citizens, civil society, and so on. Like it or not, the government is there. We should make it function better, utilize resources better, reduce corruption. be more accountable, and so on. And there's a role for each of these different entities that we mentioned: national, local governments, NGOs, civil society, and business. And so, don't be so enamored about business taking over. You know what's happening in Wall Street, no? What do you call the movements? Occupy, what happened to big business in the United States and other countries. So don't be too. I think we have to strengthen. We have to develop our local government institutions, and all of this. Civil society, of course, is very essential.
Thank you. Very quickly. I think if there's anything I think that we should take from this, it's the importance of one, there's no one size fits all. We can look at the experience of federalism in other parts of the country, but at the end of the day, we have to evolve our own model. Number two, there's a